At midnight on New Year's Eve, my passenger whispered, "He won't live to see 2026," then smiled at me. The dashboard clock glowed 11:47 p.m. as I pulled up to the address on Bleecker Street. December 31st, 2024. Another New Year's Eve spent behind the wheel instead of with family. But that's the thing about driving Uber in Manhattan. Holidays are when you make your real money. Drunk college kids, desperate singles, couples fighting their way home from disappointing parties, they all need a ride, and they all tip extra when the ball's about to drop. I'd been doing this for 3 years now, ever since the factory closed and took my pension dreams with it. At 52, you learn that dignity is a luxury you can't afford when you've got a mortgage and a daughter heading to college. The city swallows your pride one fare at a time, but it pays the bills. The pickup location was outside one of those narrow brownstones that probably cost more than I'd make in a lifetime. Through my windshield, I watched a tall figure emerge from the shadows between two parked cars. He moved with an odd, deliberate gait. Not quite a limp, but like someone who'd learned to walk differently after an injury. The streetlight caught his profile as he approached. Sharp cheekbones, silver hair slicked back, wearing an expensive-looking wool coat that seemed untouched by the December wind. "Thomas?" I called through the passenger window as he reached for the rear door handle. "That's right," he said, sliding into the back seat with surprising smoothness. His voice carried a slight accent I couldn't place, European, maybe Eastern European. LaGuardia Airport, Terminal C. I glanced in the rearview mirror as I pulled away from the curb. He was older than I'd initially thought, maybe mid-60s, with pale gray eyes that seemed to take in everything without settling on anything in particular. His hands were folded carefully in his lap, and I noticed a thin scar running from his left temple down to his jawline. "Catching a red eye somewhere?" I asked, trying to make conversation as we merged into the surprisingly light traffic on Houston Street. Most people were either already where they needed to be for midnight or hunkered down in bars and restaurants waiting for the countdown. "Something like that," he replied, his tone suggesting he wasn't interested in small talk. The radio was playing soft jazz, interrupted every few minutes by some DJ reminding everyone that we had less than 15 minutes until 2025. I turned it down and focused on driving, but something about my passenger kept nagging at me. Maybe it was the way he'd emerged from between those cars instead of from the building. Maybe it was how he kept checking his phone, not scrolling or texting, just staring at a black screen like he was waiting for something. We were stopped at a red light on the Williamsbridge approach when my own phone buzzed with a text message. The sound made Thomas look up sharply, and I caught his eyes in the mirror. For just a second, I saw something there, alertness, maybe even alarm. "Sorry," I said, reaching for my phone. "Just need to check this real quick." The message was from a number I didn't recognize. "Don't react. The man in the back is watching you." My blood went cold. I stared at the words, reading them twice to make sure I hadn't misunderstood. My hands started to sweat on the steering wheel, but I forced myself to keep my expression neutral as I set the phone back down. "Everything all right?" Thomas asked from behind me. "Yeah, just my dispatcher," I lied, my mouth suddenly dry. "Confirming the destination." The light turned green, and I pressed the gas, my mind racing. Who would send me a message like that? How would they know I had a passenger, let alone what he looked like? I glanced in the mirror again, trying to study Thomas without being obvious about it. He was looking out the window now, but I could see his reflection in the glass. He wasn't watching the city pass by. He was watching me. My phone buzzed again. This time I waited until we were in traffic to check it, pretending to adjust the GPS. "He's not who he says he is. Play along. Help is coming." The words blurred slightly as my heart hammered against my ribs. Help from who? And what did they mean he wasn't who he says he was? He'd barely said anything beyond giving me the destination. "How long until we reach the airport?" Thomas asked, and something in his tone made me look up. He was leaning forward slightly, and I realized he'd been watching me read the messages. "Traffic's light," I managed. "Maybe 25 minutes." "Good," he said, settling back into his seat. "I have time." Time for what? The question screamed in my head, but I kept driving, trying to process what was happening. Someone was warning me about my passenger, someone who seemed to know more about this situation than I did. But who? And why were they helping me? As we drove through Queens, Thomas began to talk, his voice taking on a conversational tone that somehow felt more threatening than his earlier silence. "You know," he said, "I've always been fascinated by people like you, men who drive strangers around for a living. It requires a certain trust, doesn't it? Letting anyone into your car, taking them wherever they want to go?" "I guess so," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Of course, sometimes that trust is misplaced," he continued. "Sometimes the person in your back seat isn't really going where they claim to be going. Sometimes they have entirely different plans." The hair on the back of my neck stood up. Was he threatening me, or was this just an unfortunate coincidence of timing with those text messages? I checked the mirror again and saw that he was smiling, a cold, thin expression that didn't reach his eyes. "Take tonight, for example," Thomas went on. New Year's Eve, a time for resolutions, for fresh starts, but also a time for settling old scores, a time when certain debts come due. My phone buzzed a third time. I wanted to check it desperately, but Thomas was watching me too closely now. Instead, I focused on the road ahead, on getting through this ride without whatever was happening escalating further. "You seem nervous, friend," Thomas observed. "Is everything all right?" "Just tired," I said. "Long shift." "Ah, yes, the working man's burden. Tell me, do you have family, wife, children?" The question sent ice through my veins. Why would he want to know about my family unless he was planning to threaten them? I thought about my daughter Sarah, probably at some New Year's party right now, surrounded by friends and laughter and all the possibilities that come with being 21. I thought about my ex-wife Maria, who'd probably fall asleep on her couch watching the ball drop, same as she did every year. I said carefully. "It must be difficult being away from them on a night like this. But then again, sometimes distance is a blessing. Sometimes the people we love are safer when they're far away from us." The words hung in the air like a threat, and I realized my hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles had gone white. We were getting close to the airport now. I could see the signs for the various terminals coming up. Part of me wanted this ride to end as quickly as possible, but another part was terrified of what might happen when we reached our destination. As we approached the airport exit, Thomas leaned forward again. "Actually," he said, "I've changed my mind about the destination. Take the next exit instead." "But you said Terminal C." "I said take the next exit." His voice had lost all pretense of friendliness. I looked in the mirror and saw that he was no longer smiling. His pale eyes were fixed on mine with an intensity that made my stomach clench. This wasn't a request. "Where am I taking you?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "Somewhere quiet," Thomas replied. "Somewhere we can talk." The exit ramp led to a stretch of industrial buildings and empty lots that bordered the airport. At this time of night, with most businesses closed for the holiday, the area was deserted except for the occasional security guard making rounds. I followed Thomas' directions, turning left onto a narrow road that ran between two warehouses, then right into what looked like an abandoned parking lot. "Stop here," he said when we reached the far end of the lot, where a chain-link fence separated us from a construction site. The only light came from a single street lamp about 50 yards away, casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. I put the car in park, but kept the engine running, my finger hovering over the door lock button. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to run, but I was trapped in the driver's seat with Thomas directly behind me. Even if I could get out of the car, he'd probably be faster, and I still didn't know what he was capable of. "Turn off the engine," Thomas said quietly. "I think there's been some kind of misunderstanding." "Turn off the engine!" I reached for the keys with trembling fingers, and as the engine died, the silence that filled the car felt suffocating. Outside, I could hear the distant hum of planes taking off from LaGuardia, carrying people toward new lives and fresh starts, while I sat trapped in what might be my last few minutes on Earth. Thomas didn't say anything for a long moment, and the waiting was almost worse than whatever threat might come next. I could hear him breathing behind me, could feel his presence like a weight pressing down on my shoulders. "Do you know who I am?" he finally asked. "No," I replied, honestly. "My name isn't Thomas. It's Viktor Kozlov, and 3 years ago, you killed my son." The words hit me like a physical blow. I twisted around in my seat to face him, confusion and terror warring in my chest. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said. "I've never killed anyone." Victor's smile returned, but it was even colder than before. "July 15th, 2021. You were driving east on Route 495, coming home from your night shift at the factory. It was raining, and you were tired, so tired that you didn't see the motorcycle until it was too late." The memory came flooding back with sickening clarity. The rain, the late hour, the split second when I'd seen the headlights swerving toward my lane and realized there was nothing I could do. The terrible sound of impact, the way my car had shuddered, the image of the motorcycle sliding across the wet asphalt in a shower of sparks. "The police report said it was an accident," Victor continued. "Poor visibility, wet roads, no criminal charges filed. The insurance company paid out, you went on with your life, and my 28-year-old son went into the ground." "It was an accident," I whispered. "I tried to stop. I tried to help." "You tried," Victor repeated mockingly. "Yes, I'm sure you did. Just like you're trying now to convince me that my son's life was worth something to you. But the truth is, you went home that night, you slept in your bed, you woke up the next morning and had breakfast while my Alexei was lying in a morgue with half his skull caved in." My phone was sitting in the cup holder between the front seats, and I could see it had buzzed again during our conversation. Victor noticed me looking at it and leaned forward. "Expecting someone?" he asked. "A rescue, perhaps?" Before I could react, he reached over the seat and grabbed the phone, scanning the messages with interest. "How fascinating," he murmured. "It seems someone is trying to warn you about me." He's not who he says he is. Play along. Help is coming. Tell me, do you have any idea who might be sending these? I shook my head, genuinely confused. I'd been wondering the same thing myself. Victor studied the phone for a moment longer, then tossed it back to me. "It doesn't matter. Whoever it is, they're too late." He reached into his coat, and I caught a glimpse of something metallic. My mouth went completely dry, and I found myself thinking about Sarah again, about how I'd never get to see her graduate, never walk her down the aisle, never meet my grandchildren. "Please," I said, "I know you're angry, and you have every right to be, but killing me won't bring your son back." "No," Victor agreed, "but it will balance the scales. An eye for an eye, a life for a life. It's an old concept, but a satisfying one." The metallic object turned out to be a gun, a small pistol that looked almost delicate in Victor's weathered hands. He held it casually, like someone familiar with weapons, and I realized that this wasn't the desperate act of a grieving father. This was something he'd planned, something he'd thought through carefully. "I've been looking for you for 3 years," he said, conversationally. "It wasn't easy. The police report had your name blacked out. Insurance companies don't like to share information, and you moved out of your old neighborhood after the divorce. But I am a patient man, and I have resources."
How did you find me? Your ex-wife still uses your last name on social media. She posted a picture last month of your daughter's college acceptance letter, mentioned how proud she was that you were working 2 jobs to pay for tuition. A little research revealed that one of those jobs was driving for Uber. After that, it was just a matter of requesting rides until I got lucky. I stared at him in horror, realizing how thoroughly I'd been hunted. "You've been planning this for months." "Years," Victor corrected, and tonight seemed appropriate. New Year's Eve, a time for endings and beginnings. The end of your life, the beginning of my peace. My phone buzzed again, and this time Victor gestured for me to check it. The message read, "Duck now." I had maybe half a second to process the words before throwing myself sideways across the front seats. The passenger side window exploded inward in a shower of glass, and I heard Victor cry out in surprise and pain. Through the ringing in my ears, I could hear voices outside the car, multiple people shouting commands I couldn't make out. I lay pressed against the passenger seat, my heart hammering, as I tried to understand what was happening. Car doors were opening, feet were running across gravel, and Victor was cursing in what sounded like Russian. "Drop the weapon," someone shouted.
"NYPD, drop the weapon and put your hands where we can see them." Police? How did they know where to find us? I heard Victor's gun clatter across the asphalt, followed by the sound of him being dragged from the back seat. Still too terrified to move, I remained huddled in the front seat until a female voice spoke from outside the driver's door. "Sir, are you injured? It's safe to come out now." Slowly, carefully, I pulled myself upright. A black woman in a police vest was standing beside my car, her weapon holstered but her hand resting on it. Behind her, I could see Victor on his knees with his hands zip-tied behind his back, blood running from a cut on his forehead where he'd apparently hit the window frame. "I'm Detective Rivera," the woman said. "Are you hurt?" I shook my head, not trusting my voice yet. "Can you step out of the vehicle, please? We need to make sure you're okay, and we have some questions." My legs felt like rubber as I climbed out of the car, but Detective Rivera steadied me with a hand on my elbow. Now that I was standing, I could see there were at least 4 police cars positioned around the parking lot, their red and blue lights painting the scene in surreal colors. "How did you know?" I managed to ask. Detective Rivera smiled grimly. "Victor Kozlov has been on our radar for quite a while. He's wanted in connection with several deaths in Eastern Europe. We think he's some kind of professional killer. When he entered the country 6 months ago under a false passport, Homeland Security flagged him, but he disappeared before we could pick him up." "But the text messages?" "We've been monitoring his phone activity, trying to track his location. When we saw him booking an Uber ride tonight, we realized he might be planning something. We sent those messages to try to keep you safe until we could get units in position." I looked over at Victor, who was being helped to his feet by 2 uniformed officers. Even injured and defeated, there was something coldly professional about him that made my skin crawl. "The story about his son," I said, "was any of that true?" Detective Rivera consulted a tablet one of her colleagues handed her. "There was a motorcycle accident in July 2021 involving a Victor Kozlov Jr., age 28. But our Victor here is no grieving father. We think he's using the identity of the real Victor Kozlov, who died of cancer in Prague 2 years ago.
The man you were just talking to is probably someone named Dmitry Volkov, a contract killer wanted for at least 6 murders. The revelation hit me like another physical blow. Then why was he after me if his son isn't really dead? We're not sure yet. It's possible you were a random target, or maybe someone hired him to kill you specifically, and the son story was just psychological warfare. We'll know more after we interrogate him.
As they loaded the man I'd known as Victor into the back of a patrol car, he looked directly at me through the window. There was no anger in his expression now, no grief or vengeance, just the cold, calculating stare of a predator who'd been caught. Detective Rivera handed me a business card. "We'll need you to come in tomorrow to give a full statement, but for now you're free to go. I'd recommend having someone stay with you for the next few days, just as a precaution." I nodded numbly, still trying to process everything that had happened. As the police cars pulled away, leaving me alone in the parking lot with my Uber, I realized the dashboard clock now read 12:23 a.m. I'd made it to 2025 after all. The drive home felt like it took hours, even though it was probably only 30 minutes. Every shadow seemed threatening, every pedestrian a potential danger. I kept checking my mirrors, expecting to see Victor, or Dmitry, or whoever he really was, somehow escaped and following me. The rational part of my brain knew he was in police custody, but rational thinking and trauma don't always occupy the same space. I parked in my building's underground garage and sat in the car for a long time, staring at my hands on the steering wheel. They were still shaking, and I couldn't seem to make them stop. The events of the past few hours felt both hyper-real and completely surreal, like a movie I'd watched rather than something I'd lived through.
My phone, still functional despite everything, showed 17 missed calls from Maria and 12 from Sarah. Word travels fast in a family, especially when the police contact your emergency contacts to let them know you've been involved in an incident. I knew I should call them back, should reassure them that I was okay, but I wasn't sure that was true yet. Instead, I climbed the stairs to my apartment, a one-bedroom place that had seemed adequate when I'd moved in after the divorce, but now felt like a refuge. I triple-checked the locks on the door and windows, then poured myself 3 fingers of bourbon and sat down in my recliner to think. The questions Detective Rivera couldn't answer were eating at me. Why had Victor, Dmitry, chosen me as a target? The motorcycle accident was real, but he wasn't the victim's father, so that couldn't be the real motive. Was it truly random, just the bad luck of accepting the wrong ride request? Or was there something else, something I wasn't seeing? I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my recent rides, looking for patterns or connections. In the past month, I'd driven dozens of passengers to airports, hotels, restaurants, bars. I'd picked up tourists, business travelers, couples on dates, people going to and from work. Nothing stood out as unusual or threatening. Then I remembered something Victor had said. Sometimes the people in your back seat aren't really going where they claim to be going. At the time, I'd thought he was threatening me. But what if he'd been talking about someone else? What if one of my recent passengers had been using me to get to a location they couldn't or shouldn't visit directly? I started going through my ride history more carefully, focusing on trips that had seemed odd at the time. There was the woman who'd had me drop her off 3 blocks from her stated destination. The businessman who changed his pickup location twice before settling on a spot that was clearly not where he worked. The teenager who'd paid cash and asked me to turn off the GPS tracking. Any of them could have been involved in something illegal, something that might have put me on the radar of people like Victor. The thought that I might have unknowingly aided criminals was disturbing, but it was better than believing I'd been targeted completely at random. My phone rang, interrupting my speculation. Sarah's name appeared on the screen, and I knew I couldn't avoid the conversation any longer. "Dad? Oh my God, are you okay? Mom said the police called and said you were attacked." "I'm fine, sweetheart," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. "It was just a misunderstanding that got out of hand. Everything's resolved now." "Are you sure? Mom wants to drive over there." No, don't let her do that. It's late, and I'm really okay. I'll call you both in the morning and explain everything. Promise? Promise. After I hung up, I realized it was the first time in hours that I'd felt something other than fear or confusion. Talking to Sarah, hearing the concern in her voice, reminded me that life would go on. Whatever had happened tonight, whatever the real reasons behind it, I'd survived. I'd gotten through it, and tomorrow I'd start figuring out what came next. But first, I needed to make a decision about driving for Uber. The money was good, and I needed it for Sarah's tuition, but tonight had shown me just how vulnerable the job made me. Every time I accepted a ride request, I was essentially inviting a stranger into my car and my life. Most of the time, that stranger was just someone who needed to get from point A to B. But sometimes, apparently, they were professional killers with agendas I couldn't begin to understand. I finished my bourbon and headed for the bedroom, exhausted but still too wired to sleep. As I changed clothes, I caught sight of myself in the mirror and was surprised by what I saw. I looked older than I had that morning, more worn down, but also somehow more resilient. I'd faced something genuinely terrifying and come out the other side. That had to count for something. My phone buzzed with one final message of the night, from the same unknown number that had sent the warnings earlier. Glad you're safe. There's more to this story. Meet me tomorrow at Rosario's Diner on Queens Boulevard at 2 p.m. if you want answers.
I stared at the message for a long time, weighing my options. The smart thing would be to ignore it, to let the police handle whatever investigation they were conducting, to go back to my normal life and pretend tonight had never happened. But the smart thing wasn't always the right thing, and I'd learned tonight that sometimes you had to take risks to protect the people you cared about. I set my phone on the nightstand and lay down, pulling the covers up to my chin like a child afraid of monsters under the bed. Outside my window, New York City was settling into the first hours of 2025, and somewhere in the distance, I could hear the sound of late-night traffic carrying people toward their destinations. Tomorrow, I decided, I'd go to the diner. I'd meet whoever had been sending me those messages, and I'd get the answers that Detective Rivera couldn't provide. Because if tonight had taught me anything, it was that ignorance wasn't protection. It was just another kind of vulnerability. And I'd been vulnerable long enough. I didn't sleep much that night. Every sound in the hallway made me sit up in bed. Every car engine outside my window made me reach for the baseball bat I'd propped against the nightstand. By the time dawn broke over Queens, I'd maybe managed 2 hours of actual rest, but I felt more alert than I had in months.
The morning news was full of New Year's Day coverage, highlights from celebrations around the world, predictions for 2025, the usual feel-good stories about fresh starts and new beginnings. I watched it all with a kind of detached fascination, marveling at how normal everything seemed when my own world had been turned upside down less than 12 hours ago. Detective Rivera called around 10 a.m. to check on me and to schedule my official statement for later in the week. She also had some preliminary information about Victor, or Dmitri, as I was trying to think of him now. We ran his fingerprints through international databases, she said. Turns out our boy has been busy. In addition to the murders in Eastern Europe, there are at least 3 unsolved killings in the U.S. that match his methods. All of them involved people who worked in transportation: taxi drivers, delivery drivers, a couple of truckers. Why transportation workers? I asked. We are not sure yet. It could be that he sees them as easy targets, people who are isolated and vulnerable. Or it could be that he's been hired to eliminate people who've seen something they shouldn't have seen. The second possibility sent a chill through me. You think one of my passengers was involved in something illegal? It's one theory we're exploring. We're going to need a list of everyone you've driven in the past 6 months, along with any details you can remember about their behavior or destinations.
After I hung up with Detective Rivera, I spent the morning going through my ride records, making notes about anything that had seemed unusual at the time. The process was tedious but oddly comforting. It gave me something concrete to focus on while I waited for the afternoon meeting at Rosario's diner. By 1:30 p.m., I was parked across the street from the diner, watching the lunch crowd filter in and out. Rosario's was one of those old-school places that had been serving the same menu for decades: red vinyl booths, black and white checkered floors, and the kind of coffee that could strip paint. It was also busy enough that a conversation could be held without being overheard, which I assumed was why my mysterious contact had chosen it. At exactly 2 p.m., a woman in her 40s walked in and looked around the dining room with the systematic attention of someone who'd been trained to assess threats. She was wearing jeans and a dark jacket, and she moved with the kind of controlled precision I'd seen in cops and military personnel. When her eyes found mine through the window, she nodded slightly and gestured toward an empty booth in the back corner. I paid my parking meter and crossed the street, my heart rate picking up with each step. This could be another trap, another danger I was walking into voluntarily. But I needed answers more than I needed safety, and sometimes the only way forward is through the fear. The woman was already seated when I entered the diner, her back to the wall and her eyes on the entrance. As I approached her booth, she stood and extended her hand. "Jack Morrison?" she asked. "I'm Agent Sarah Chen, FBI." She was younger than I'd initially thought, maybe late 30s, with short black hair and dark eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Her grip was firm and professional, and when she showed me her credentials, they looked genuine enough. "Thank you for coming," she said as we both sat down. "I know last night was traumatic, and I appreciate you being willing to hear me out." "You're the one who sent those text messages?" "My team, yes. We've been tracking Victor, Dmitry Volkov, for almost a year now. When we realized he was targeting you, we tried to intervene as quickly as possible." A waitress appeared and poured coffee without being asked. Agent Chen waited until she was gone before continuing. "What Detective Rivera told you last night was accurate but incomplete," she said. "Dmitry Volkov is indeed a contract killer, and he has been eliminating transportation workers across multiple states. But we don't think you were a random target." "Then why was he after me?" Agent Chen pulled on a tablet and scrolled to a photograph that made my stomach drop. It showed a man in his 50s getting out of my Uber, his face clearly visible as he handed me cash through the driver's window. "Do you remember this passenger?" she asked. November 23rd. Pickup from Manhattan, drop-off in Queens. I studied the photo, trying to place the face. Maybe. I drive a lot of people. What's special about this one? His name is Anton Reyes, and he's a key witness in a federal investigation involving Russian money laundering and human trafficking. 3 weeks after you drove him to that meeting in Queens, he disappeared. We found his body yesterday morning. The coffee in my mouth suddenly tasted like ash. You think Dmitry killed him? We think Dmitry was hired to kill him, yes, but we also think Reyes might have said something during your ride that compromised the investigation, something that made you a liability. I set down my coffee cup with shaking hands. What kind of something? Agent Chen scrolled to another screen on her tablet, this one showing what looked like a transcript of a phone conversation. "This is from a wiretap we had on one of our suspects," she said. "The conversation took place 3 days ago. The driver heard everything. He knows about the warehouse, about the schedule. We can't take the chance." "I don't remember any warehouse," I said desperately. "I don't remember anything unusual about that ride at all." "That's what we were hoping you'd say. But Reyes was paranoid, and he'd been drinking that night. Our surveillance shows he made several phone calls during the ride, calls he probably assumed you couldn't hear over the radio." Agent Chen turned the tablet toward me, and I saw a detailed map of Queens with several locations marked in red. "We think Reyes was giving someone the locations of safe houses used by witnesses in our investigation.
If you overheard those addresses, you became the only person who could connect Reyes to the leak. I stared at the map, trying to remember anything from that night in November. It had been cold, I remembered that much. And yes, the passenger had made several phone calls, speaking quietly in what I'd assumed was Spanish. I'd turned up the radio to give him privacy, but car interiors aren't soundproof. Even if I did overhear something, I said, I wouldn't have understood what it meant. Addresses are just addresses to me. But they're not to the people who hired Dmitri. They couldn't take the chance that you might remember something later, might put pieces together if you saw news reports about missing witnesses. The full implications of what she was telling me were starting to sink in. How many other witnesses are there? Were, Agent Chen corrected grimly. As of yesterday, Anton Reyes was the last one, which means our case just collapsed and a lot of very dangerous people are about to walk free. I leaned back in the booth, feeling overwhelmed by the scope of what I'd been dragged into. So what happens now? Dmitri's in custody, but whoever hired him is still out there. That's what I want to talk to you about.
We think there's a chance, a small chance, that we can salvage this investigation, but we need your help. My help? I'm just an Uber driver. Agent Chen smiled for the first time since I'd met her. You're an Uber driver who survived an assassination attempt and helped us capture one of the most wanted killers in the world. Don't sell yourself short. She scrolled to a new screen on her tablet, this one showing surveillance photos of several men in expensive suits. These are the people we believe hired Dmitri to clean up their witness problem. They think you're dead. Dmitri was supposed to make it look like a robbery gone wrong. Dump your body somewhere it wouldn't be found for days. When they find out you're still alive, they're going to panic. That doesn't sound like a good thing for me. It's not in the short term, but panicked people make mistakes, and mistakes are what we need to build a new case. We want to offer you protection in exchange for your cooperation. I thought about Sarah, about Maria, about the ordinary life I'd been trying to build after losing the factory job. All of it seemed very far away now, like something that had happened to someone else. What kind of cooperation? I asked. Agent Chen leaned forward, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. We want you to let them think they succeeded. The plan Agent Chen outlined was simultaneously simple and terrifying. The FBI would fake my death, complete with a body found in the East River and a news report about another robbery victim in New York City's ongoing crime wave. Meanwhile, I would assume a new identity and work undercover to gather evidence against the criminal organization that had targeted me. You'd be working with our organized crime task force, Agent Chen explained. We'd provide training, backup, and a new identity that would hold up under scrutiny. In exchange, you'd help us rebuild the case against the trafficking operation. And after that, assuming I survive? Witness protection, if you want it. A new life, a new name, somewhere far from New York. Or you could come work for us. We can always use people with your skills and experience. I almost laughed at that. What skills? I drive cars for a living. You stayed calm under pressure last night. You followed instructions, you improvised when you needed to, and you survived. Those are exactly the skills we need. The offer was tempting, but it would mean giving up everything I'd built since the divorce. Sarah would grow up thinking I was dead. Maria would mourn a man who was actually living a lie hundreds of miles away. And there was no guarantee that this new case would succeed where the first one had failed. I need time to think about it, I said. Of course, but not too much time. Once word gets out that Dmitri was arrested, his employers are going to start covering their tracks. We probably have 48 hours before they disappear completely. Agent Chen stood to leave, then paused and sat back down. There's one more thing, she said, pulling out a manila envelope. We found this in Dmitri's hotel room. She slid a photograph across the table, and my blood turned to ice. It was a picture of Sarah walking out of her dorm building, taken with a telephoto lens from across the street. Someone had written a date and time in red ink across the bottom, December 28th, 3 days ago. "He wasn't just planning to kill you," Agent Chen said quietly. "He was mapping your entire family, your daughter, your ex-wife, even your ex-wife's sister in Brooklyn. This wasn't going to end with you." I stared at the photograph, my hands trembling with rage and terror. Sarah looked so young, so innocent, completely unaware that a killer had been watching her, planning God knows what. "They would have killed her too?" I whispered. "Eventually, yes. Anyone who might have heard you mention something about that November ride. Anyone you might have confided in. Dimitri's employers don't leave loose ends." The decision crystallized in that moment. I couldn't go back to my normal life knowing that Sarah and Maria were still in danger. I couldn't pretend this hadn't happened and hope that the next killer would be less thorough than Dimitri. "Okay," I said, "I'll do it." Agent Chen nodded, but I could see concern in her eyes.
Are you sure? Once we start this process, there's no going back. Your old life will be over, permanently. My old life was over the moment I accepted that ride request, I replied. At least this way I can make sure my family is safe. She gathered up the photographs and tablet, then handed me a business card with only a phone number printed on it. "Call this number tomorrow at exactly noon. We'll give you instructions for the next step. Until then, go home, act normal, but be very careful. Word about Dimitri's arrest will leak soon, and his employers might try to tie up loose ends before they disappear." After Agent Chen left, I sat in the diner for another hour, nursing cold coffee and trying to process the magnitude of what I'd agreed to. In less than 24 hours, I'd gone from being a middle-aged Uber driver worried about making rent to being a federal informant about to fake his own death. The drive home felt like a farewell tour of my life. Every familiar street, every bodega where I'd bought coffee, every traffic light where I'd waited during the hundreds of rides I'd given, all of it would soon be memories from someone else's existence. My apartment looked different when I walked in, smaller somehow, like I was seeing it through the eyes of someone who didn't live there anymore. I started going through my belongings, trying to decide what could be saved and what would have to be left behind. The photo albums, the certificates from Sarah's school events, the coffee mug Maria had given me for our last anniversary, they'd all have to stay with the dead man I was about to become. I called Sarah that evening just to hear her voice one more time as her father. "Hey, Dad, how are you feeling? Better than last night, I hope?" "Much better, sweetheart. I just wanted to tell you how proud I am of you. College, your job at the campus bookstore, everything you've accomplished." "That's sweet of you to say. Are you sure you're okay? You sound kinda, I don't know, serious?" "I'm fine. I just love you very much, and I wanted to make sure you knew that." "I love you too, Dad. We should have dinner this weekend, catch up properly." "I'd like that," I said, knowing it would never happen. After I hung up, I sat in my recliner and tried to imagine what my new life might look like. A different name, a different city, a different job, maybe even a different appearance if the FBI decided that was necessary. Would I be able to adapt? Would I be able to live with the loneliness of knowing that everyone I'd ever cared about believed I was dead? My phone rang at exactly 10 p.m. Detective Rivera's name appeared on the screen. "Jack, I hope I'm not calling too late. We got some interesting information from Dimitri's interrogation, and I wanted to give you a heads up." "What kind of information?" "He's claiming that you weren't his only target."
According to him, there are at least 3 other drivers in the city who were supposed to be eliminated. We're trying to verify the information now, but I wanted you to know that this might be bigger than we initially thought. Did he say why? What these drivers supposedly witnessed? Same thing we discussed before. They might have overheard conversations or seen something they shouldn't have. But Jack, there's something else. Dmitri is asking to make a deal. He says he'll give us everything about his employers in exchange for protection. This was news I hadn't expected. If Dmitri cooperated with the police investigation, would that change the FBI's plans? Would they still need me to go undercover if they had the killer's testimony? What do you think his information is worth? I asked. Hard to say. These international crime organizations are like hydras. Cut off one head and two more appear. But if Dmitri really has been working for them for years, he might know enough to bring down the entire network. After Detective Rivera hung up, I called the number Agent Chen had given me, even though it was past midnight and she'd told me to wait until noon. Chen? It's Jack Morrison. I just heard that Dmitri might cooperate with the NYPD. Does that change anything about tomorrow? There was a pause, and I could hear muffled conversation in the background. Where are you right now? She asked. At home. Why? Get out. Right now.
Don't pack anything. Don't stop to grab personal items. Just leave. There's been a development. My blood turned cold. What kind of development? Dimitri's dead. Someone got to him in his cell about an hour ago, made it look like suicide, which means his employers know he was talking, and they're going to assume he told us everything. I was already moving toward the door, grabbing my keys and wallet from the kitchen counter. They're coming for me now, aren't they? Probably, and they won't be as subtle as Dmitri was. Get to your car and drive to... The line went dead. I stared at the phone for maybe 2 seconds before I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my apartment. Heavy boots, multiple people, trying to move quietly but not quite succeeding. There was no time to think, no time to plan. I turned off the lights and moved to the window that faced the fire escape, trying to remember if I'd ever tested the rusty latch that hadn't been opened in years. The lock on my front door rattled, and I heard the unmistakable sound of someone working on it with lockpicks. Professional tools, professional technique. This wasn't a random break-in. The fire escape window finally opened, with a squeal of protest that sounded impossibly loud in the quiet night. I climbed through just as I heard my front door open, and voices began searching the apartment. Check the bedroom. Kitchen's clear. He was just here. Coffee's still warm. I made it down one flight of the fire escape before someone shouted from my window. A flashlight beam swept across the alley, and I pressed myself against the brick wall, trying to become invisible. There! On the fire escape! The first gunshot shattered a window 2 feet from my head. I half fell, half ran down the remaining flights, landing hard in the alley behind my building just as my phone started ringing. Agent Chen again. Jack, where are you? Fire escape, behind my building. People are shooting at me. Can you get to your car? I peered around the corner of the alley. My Honda was parked on the street, but I could see at least 2 men standing near it, and probably more that I couldn't see. Negative, they're watching it. Okay, listen carefully. There's a subway entrance 3 blocks east of your building. Can you make it there without being seen? I don't know. Maybe. Do it. Take the N train to 36th Street, then switch to the D. Get off at Atlantic Terminal and go to the Long Island Railroad information desk. Someone will be waiting for you. How will I know who? They'll know you. Go, now. I ended the call and started moving through the network of alleys behind the apartment buildings, staying in the shadows and trying to avoid the main streets. Every sound made me freeze. A car engine, footsteps on pavement, voices calling to each other in languages I didn't recognize. It took me nearly 40 minutes to cover those 3 blocks, moving like a fugitive through the city where I'd lived my entire life. When I finally made it to the subway entrance, I expected to see more people waiting for me, but the platform was mostly empty except for a few late-night commuters. The train ride gave me time to think about what had just happened.
In the space of less than 2 days, I'd gone from ordinary citizen to federal witness to hunted man. My apartment, the first place that had felt like home since the divorce, was now a crime scene. My car was probably being stripped for tracking devices. My phone was compromised, my credit cards were being monitored, and my face was probably being distributed to every criminal organization in the city. Agent Chen had been right about one thing. My old life was definitely over. At Atlantic Terminal, I found the LIRR information desk and tried to look like a normal passenger, asking about schedules. The clerk, a tired-looking woman in her 60s, glanced at me and said quietly, "Are you Jack?" I nodded. "Men's room, 3rd stall from the left. Wait there." The bathroom was empty, except for one other man washing his hands at the sink. When he left, I went to the designated stall and found an envelope taped under the toilet seat. Inside were a train ticket to Philadelphia, $500 in cash, and a note that read, "Car 3, seat 14A. Sleep if you can. Someone will meet you at 30th Street Station." The train was nearly empty. It was past 2 a.m. now, and most people weren't traveling between New York and Philadelphia at that hour. I found my seat and tried to relax, but every time the train stopped, I expected armed men to board and drag me off. Instead, a conductor checked my ticket with board efficiency, and an hour later, I was walking through the echoing halls of Philadelphia's 30th Street Station, looking for whoever was supposed to meet me. I didn't have to look long. A young man in a Phillies cap approached me near the information board. "Jack Morrison?" he asked quietly. "Yes. I'm David. Agent Chen sent me. We need to keep moving." He led me through the station and out to a parking garage where an unremarkable sedan was waiting. As we drove through the empty streets of Philadelphia, David explained what came next. "There's a safe house about an hour outside the city. You'll stay there while we work on your new identity. The whole process will take about a week. New social security number, driver's license, credit history, everything you need to start over." "And then?" "Then you become Thomas Walker, a widower from Ohio, who's relocating to Florida to be closer to his grandchildren. You'll have a job waiting, nothing glamorous, but it pays well and comes with good benefits." "What kind of job?" David glanced at me in the rearview mirror. "Security consultant for a shipping company in Miami."
Your job will be to identify weaknesses in their transportation network and recommend improvements. I almost laughed despite everything. So I'll still be working in transportation? Agent Chen thought it would be easier for you to adapt if your new job built on skills you already had. Plus, the Miami shipping industry has a lot of connections to the same criminal networks we're investigating. You'll be in a perfect position to gather intelligence. As we drove through the Pennsylvania countryside, I watched my old life disappear in the rearview mirror. Somewhere behind us, Sarah was probably asleep in her dorm room, unaware that her father had just been declared dead. Maria was probably staying up late, reading or watching old movies, not knowing that she was now a widow for the 2nd time. The safe house was a modest ranch home surrounded by farmland, the kind of place where no one would think to look for a dead Uber driver from Queens. David showed me to a bedroom that was clean but impersonal, like a low-end hotel room. "Get some sleep if you can," he said. "Tomorrow we start building Thomas Walker from the ground up." I lay down on the unfamiliar bed and stared at the ceiling, wondering if I'd made the right choice. In trying to protect my family, I'd lost them forever. In agreeing to help the FBI, I'd traded one dangerous situation for another that might be even more perilous. But as I thought about Sarah walking across that campus, unaware that a killer had been watching her, I knew I'd made the only choice I could live with, even if living with it meant becoming someone else entirely. 6 months later, Thomas Walker stood in the air-conditioned office of Meridian Shipping Solutions, reviewing security reports and trying to remember what it felt like to be Jack Morrison.
The transformation had been so complete that sometimes I caught myself responding to my new name even in my own thoughts. The FBI had done excellent work creating my new identity. Thomas Walker had a credit score, a rental history, and even a few carefully placed social media posts that established him as a quiet widower who preferred fishing to crowds. The shipping company believed they'd hired an experienced security consultant who specialized in transportation vulnerabilities, which wasn't entirely untrue, since my months as an Uber driver had given me insights into how easily criminal organizations could exploit transportation networks. What my employers didn't know was that Thomas Walker was also documenting every suspicious shipment, every off-books transaction, and every conversation that suggested illegal activity. The evidence I'd gathered was already enough to launch several federal investigations, and I was just getting started. My handler, a different agent than Chen for security reasons, met with me once a month at a coffee shop near the port of Miami.
Agent Rodriguez was younger than Chen, maybe early 30s, with the kind of intense focus that came from working organized crime cases for years. "The intelligence you've provided has been invaluable," he told me during our most recent meeting. "We've identified at least 12 shell companies that are being used to launder money through fake shipping manifests. The Justice Department thinks we can build RICO cases against 3 different criminal organizations." "What about the people who killed Dimitri?" I asked. "Are we any closer to identifying them?" Rodriguez stirred his coffee thoughtfully. "That's actually why I wanted to meet today. We think we found them." He slid a tablet across the table, showing me surveillance photos of 2 men in expensive suits standing on what looked like a yacht. The one on the left is Alexander Petrov, Russian national with ties to several trafficking operations. The one on the right is his American business partner, Michael Torino. We believe they were the ones who hired Dimitri to eliminate witnesses in our original investigation. I studied the faces, trying to memorize every detail. Where are they now? That's the interesting part. They're here in Miami, apparently expanding their operations into South America. And based on the shipping records you've provided, we think they're using Meridian to move people and drugs through the port. The implications hit me immediately. "They're my targets now? The people I'm supposed to investigate?" "Exactly. But Jack, I need you to understand how dangerous this is. These men have killed federal witnesses before, and they won't hesitate to do it again if they suspect you're working for us." I thought about the months I'd spent building Thomas Walker's reputation, earning the trust of my colleagues at Meridian, positioning myself to gather intelligence on exactly this kind of operation. It felt like everything had come full circle. I was back to confronting the same criminals who tried to kill me, just with a different name and a more dangerous mission. "What do you need me to do?" Rodriguez leaned forward, lowering his voice even though the coffee shop was nearly empty. "Petrov and Torino are planning something big for next month. Our intelligence suggests it involves moving a large number of people through Miami, probably trafficking victims being transported to other cities. We need to know the details: timing, routes, how many people, where they're going. And how am I supposed to get that information? Torino has been asking about hiring additional security consultants. Your boss is going to recommend you for the job." The plan was elegant and terrifying. I would be working directly for the criminals who tried to have me killed, using my expertise to help them protect an operation that would destroy dozens of lives. The cognitive dissonance was staggering, but I'd learned to live with moral ambiguity during my months as Thomas Walker's. That evening, I sat in my small apartment in Coral Gables, looking through the carefully curated possessions that made up Thomas Walker's life. There were photos of a wife and grandchildren I'd never met, books about subjects I wasn't particularly interested in, and fishing equipment I'd never learned to use properly. On the desk was a framed photo that Agent Rodriguez had given me during my first week in Miami.
A picture of Sarah at her college graduation, taken from a distance with a telephoto lens. It was supposed to remind me why I was doing this, why Thomas Walker's mission mattered more than Jack Morrison's comfort. But lately, the photo just made me sad. Sarah had graduated with honors, gotten a job at a marketing firm in Boston, and was apparently dating a nice guy she'd met at work. I knew all of this from the FBI's surveillance reports, but she didn't know I was alive to be proud of her. My phone rang, interrupting my brooding. The caller ID showed my boss at Meridian. "Thomas, sorry to call so late, but I've got an opportunity I thought you'd want to hear about." "What kind of opportunity?" "Michael Torino wants to meet with you tomorrow. He's looking for someone to consult on a new venture, and I recommended you highly. This could be a big break for your career."
"I appreciate the recommendation," I said, though career advancement was the last thing on my mind. Meetings at noon, Bayside Marina, Slip 47, and Thomas, dress well. These guys appreciate attention to detail. After I hung up, I called the emergency number Rodriguez had given me and left a coded message confirming that the operation was moving forward. Then I spent the evening reviewing everything I knew about Petrov and Torino, trying to prepare for a meeting that could either advance the investigation or get Thomas Walker killed. The next morning, I put on my best suit and drove to Bayside Marina, trying to calm my nerves by focusing on the technical aspects of the mission. I had a recording device sewn into my jacket lining, a GPS tracker in my watch, and a panic button disguised as a cufflink. If everything went wrong, help would arrive within minutes. If I lived long enough for it to matter. Slip 47 housed a 60-foot yacht called New Horizons, which struck me as either deeply ironic or just another example of criminals' tendency toward grandiosity. Two men in polo shirts and khakis stood guard at the gangway, and they checked my ID carefully before allowing me aboard. Michael Torino was waiting in the yacht's main cabin, a man in his 50s with silver hair and the kind of tan that came from spending serious money on tropical vacations. He stood when I entered and offered a firm handshake.
"Thomas Walker, I've heard good things about your work at Meridian." "Mike Torino, thanks for coming out on short notice." "My pleasure. Your reputation precedes you as well." Torino smiled, but there was something calculating in his expression. "I hope that's a good thing. Can I offer you a drink? Coffee? Something stronger?" "Coffee would be great." As he poured from an expensive-looking machine, I scanned the cabin for anything that might be useful to the investigation. There were charts of South American ports on the table, shipping manifests scattered across a desk, and what looked like passenger lists with names and numbers beside them. "So," Torino said, handing me a cup, "I understand you specialize in transportation security, identifying vulnerabilities, recommending improvements?" "That's right. I focus on the human element, how people and processes can be manipulated or compromised." "Interesting. And in your experience, what's the biggest weakness in most transportation networks?" The question felt like a test, and I chose my answer carefully. "Trust," I said. "Most security systems are built around the assumption that people will follow procedures, that they'll report suspicious activity, that they'll prioritize safety over profit. But people are predictable, and predictable vulnerabilities can be exploited." Torino nodded approvingly. "That's exactly what I wanted to hear. I have a business opportunity that requires someone with your particular insights." "Are you interested in hearing about it?" "I'm listening." He moved to the chart table and gestured for me to join him. The maps showed shipping routes between Miami, Colombia, and several Central American ports. "I'm expanding into new markets," he said, "moving specialized cargo that requires discretion. The kind of cargo that needs to travel quickly and quietly without attracting attention from customs officials or other interested parties." "What kind of specialized cargo?" I asked, though I was afraid I already knew. Torino's smile never wavered, but his eyes went cold. Let's just say it's the kind that can't be listed on standard shipping manifests, the kind that requires very careful handling and absolutely reliable security. He was talking about people, human trafficking victims who would be moved through the same ports where I'd been documenting suspicious activity for months. The realization made me feel sick, but I forced myself to maintain Thomas Walker's interested, professional demeanor. "Sounds challenging," I said. "What would you need from me?" "Route analysis, security assessments, contingency planning. I need to know how to move this cargo from Miami to various destinations. Your expertise in transportation vulnerabilities could be invaluable." "And the compensation?" "Generous, very generous. But, Thomas, I need to know that you're someone I can trust completely. This isn't the kind of business where mistakes are tolerated."
The threat was subtle but unmistakable. Torino was offering me a fortune to help him destroy lives, and if I refused, or if he discovered I was working for the FBI, Thomas Walker would join the growing list of people who'd gotten in his way. "I understand," I said. "When would you need an answer?" "Take the weekend to think about it. But Thomas, I should mention, we've already done some preliminary research on you. Very impressive background, very clean record. It's rare to find someone with your skills who doesn't have complications." My blood ran cold. If they'd investigated Thomas Walker's background too thoroughly, they might have discovered inconsistencies in his fabricated history. The FBI had done excellent work creating my new identity, but no cover was perfect under intense scrutiny. "I appreciate your thoroughness," I managed. "Just good business. I'll have my assistant call you Monday morning to set up our next meeting, assuming, of course, that you decide to accept my offer." The yacht meeting ended with polite handshakes and promises to be in touch, but I could feel Torino's eyes on me as I walked back to my car. He suspected something, maybe not the whole truth, but enough to make him cautious. I drove halfway across the city before stopping at a gas station to call Rodriguez from a payphone. "We've got a problem," I said when he answered. "Torino knows more about Thomas Walker than he should. I think my cover might be compromised." What did he say specifically? I related the conversation, emphasizing Torino's comment about researching my background. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment. "Okay, here's what we're going to do," he finally said. "You're going to accept his offer and proceed with the mission, but we're moving up our timeline. Instead of gathering intelligence for months, we need everything within the next 2 weeks." "That's not much time." "It's what we have. These trafficking operations move fast, and if we miss this opportunity, it might be years before we get another chance." As I drove home to Thomas Walker's apartment, I thought about the victims whose lives depended on the success of this mission. They were probably being held somewhere in Miami right now, waiting to be transported to whatever hell Torino and Petrov had planned for them. Jack Morrison had become an Uber driver to pay his daughter's college tuition. Thomas Walker was about to become a criminal consultant to save the lives of people he'd never met. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it didn't make the mission any easier. That night, I sat at my desk and wrote 2 letters I hoped I'd never have to send. One was addressed to Sarah, explaining who Thomas Walker really was and why Jack Morrison had to die. The other was for Maria, apologizing for the deception and asking her to remember the good times instead of the lie I'd become. Then I sealed both letters in an envelope marked "In case of emergency" and put it in the safe the FBI had installed in my bedroom closet. Because if Torino and Petrov discovered who I really was, Thomas Walker wouldn't be the only one who died. They'd kill Jack Morrison all over again.